Hi, I'm Len Epp from LeanPub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Daniel Vacanti. Based in the Miami-Fort Lauderdale area, Daniel has 2 decades of experience working with and writing and speaking about lean and agile practices, including helping to develop the Kanban method for knowledge work in 2007. He is the co-founder of Actionable Agile and more recently of ProKanban.org, which helps teams and organizations improve their agile practices through training and courses. You can follow him on Twitter at Dan Vacanti, and as I mentioned, you can check out his website at ProKanban.org. Daniel is the author of a number of books that have been published on LeanPub and elsewhere, including Flow Metrics for Scrum Teams, because story points were never a part of Scrum anyway. When will it be done? Lean Agile forecasting to answer your customer's most important question, and actionable Agile metrics for predictability, an introduction. In his books, Daniel covers a lot of ground on lean and agile methods and approaches, with a particular focus on subjects like probability mathematics, and in particular on freeing teams from approaches that don't use data or math properly and engage in wasteful guesstimation that we can so easily confuse for sound analysis. In this interview, we're going to talk about Daniel's background and career, professional interests, his books, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a self-published author. So thank you very much, Daniel, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Len. I'm really, really excited to be here. Glad to have the invitation, and can't wait to get this conversation going.
Yeah, thanks. And we were really, really glad to see your great book sort of appear over time on LeanPub. That was really nice, and to find an audience as well. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found your way into a career working in sort of lean and agile methods.
Born and raised in DC, actually in the city, not too many people. I think I've only met one other person in my life who's actually born inside Washington, DC. So, if you're in DC and listening, glad that you are. As you kind of suggested, my interest early on was in mathematics. I actually graduated with a math degree, or maths, depending on where you are in the world. But quickly found out that you really can't get a job in mathematics. I mean, that's just kind of a really, really hard thing to do. But what's interesting is if you could spell C, then you got hired as a programmer when right when I graduated. So that's how I got into software development. Was I sent out a resume and they hired me. I got into agile methodologies just kind of by pure dumb luck. A couple of the teams that I was working on were kind of experimenting with them. And I got sucked into the management side of things because I kept looking around for better ways to do stuff. I mean, I kept thinking, my whole career, there's got to be a better way. When you have dates dictated to you and schedules and scope and everything dictated, it's like there's got to be something different. So the opportunity came along, and there was nobody else who really volunteered to take up the management side of things. So I did, and that's really how my agile career took off.
It's really interesting. Actually, I didn't know that you studied maths and then sort of took up programming sort of as a result of a job application. So did they do a lot of training for you? Was it a big company or a startup? What was that experience like?
It was a startup-ish that had a contract with a big company. So essentially, I was working, even though the company that was paying my paycheck was a startup. It really had the feel of a huge corporation, and things like that. And it wasn't really much on the job training. It was really kind of push in at the deep end and learn, which is as part of the maths degree that I got. They forced you essentially to get a computer science minor. That was because there was so much computer science in it that you essentially graduated university with a computer science minor. And I kept thinking, I was sitting through all these computer science classes. I'm like, when am I ever going to use this? Right? This is a waste of my time. When am I actually going to use it? And, come to find out that there was some use, but I will say this, and I'm guessing I'm hoping many other people in your program have probably said this. Pretty much everything I learned about software, about work, about everything, I learned on the job. I did not really learn anything useful at university.
That's really interesting. Actually, that leads me to ask a version of a question, which is a way into the bigger topic, but a version of a question that often comes up which is if you were starting out now, or if you were giving advice to someone who were starting out now, who was going to have a career in, let's say, computer programming and software development, and maybe with an eye on becoming someone like you in the future, moving to the management and consulting side and things like that, would you recommend doing a full computer science degree?
Wholeheartedly, no, absolutely not. I would say don't waste your time, don't waste your money. So many good code camps out there now that you can go if really what you're trying to do is get into programming. Just so many really good resources out there that we just never we I don't know how old you are, so but back when I was growing up, the interwebs was this very very nascent thing, right? Still using text browsers like links and stuff like that. So just didn't have the resources that were available to us. So and I guess I can only speak for American universities too. I don't know about universities abroad in Canada. I'm sure they're much better. But yeah, I would. And not that I have an opinion on this. Can you tell, Len? I don't have an opinion, at all. But yeah, I mean, I don't have many regrets in my life. But probably my biggest regret is going to university and paying for it.
Oh, that's really interesting that you're so straightforward about that. Some people kind of, hedge it a little bit, but to be that straightforward about it, it's one sort of question I have about that is actually kind of, you mentioned, actually being born in DC and growing up in that area. I've done some, client work in that area, and there are some big, very kind of process heavy organizations that do work down there. And I do believe that at least in the past, typically the sort of having a college degree might actually have been an entry requirement that sort of HR departments had no way around. Has that changed, do you think? I mean, like, let's say, to be specific about it, like in, say, the defense industry or things like that.
I honestly can't speak to say like something specifically like the defense industry or something like that. But most of the companies that I work at now, that I work with nowadays, I don't believe they do have that requirement, and they would be hard pressed, I think, if they did. So, I mean, you're absolutely right with your point. I think way back when, you had to actually have that degree to even get your foot in the door. That was kind of table stakes type stuff. But less and less, I don't really come across that anymore. Nor, like I said, nor would I think it's beneficial existentially to have that requirement. I mean, most of the best developers I've ever met don't have that degree, or certainly don't even have a computer science degree, but don't even have a university degree. A couple of people come to mind that don't even have university degrees are probably the best developers I've ever met.
Yeah, I've heard that from quite a few different people in the past, and I have actually heard specifically that in some of those typically more rigid industries like defense, that actually things are kind of opening up on that front. There's things like the sort of notorious war for talent in software development and stuff like that kind of force your hand, right? And again, as you mentioned, like the kind of resources that are available to you, including learning resources. Lots of people I interview for this podcast started with a magazine and sort of typing programs into something, and so we're sort of began as kind of self-taught anyway, but with code camps and like with just the incredible resources available today, and not just for learning but for actually doing, right? Like create a repo on GitHub, and you can just get going on something with relatively little training and just make a real product.
That's exactly it. I mean, like I said, with everything that's out there right now, just everything at your fingertips for free. All of this stuff just for free. You can get going. To me, it seems probably the nicest word I can think of is superfluous. To go through the quote unquote rigor of a university degree.
Yeah, my personal position on that is that one of the really important things that comes from getting a university degree, and this is specifically in-person kind of learning, is the range of acquaintance that you can develop there. And so things like, doctors become a lot less intimidating when you remember what it was like going to the bar on Friday nights with one, when you were 18 together. And, there's it's kind of like a bit of a middle sort of ticket to the middle class is like, well, now you've got if you get in legal trouble, you can call your lawyer buddy, and stuff like that. And that kind of, I mean, the sort of cheesy word for it is networking, but that kind of lifelong friendships and stuff like that can develop are really important. But if you're asking someone to spend 4 years of their youth and go into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt so they can sort of make some friends, I understand that doesn't necessarily sound like the best argument. And you mentioned, different countries, it does vary as well, right? Like if you live in a country where tuition is low, that decision's very different from when it's like, you're going to have to delay some important life choices probably because of the debt that you accumulate. But it's tough, but especially when you're young. But I think a lot of people actually enjoy hearing the sort of straightforwardness of your answer. And so you mentioned you sort of moved into the sort of management side of things. And I know you've told this story before, but I think people listening to this would be quite interesting to hear that, you were there sort of at the origins of sort of Kanban and kind of as sort of knowledge work kind of process. So if you could just talk, for a few minutes about what that story actually is.
Yeah, it was a company called Corbis in Seattle, owned by somebody that most people, hopefully, you have heard of. A guy by the name of Bill Gates owned this company called Corbis, in Seattle. And this team was tasked with kind of changing the way that they work. They weren't effective. It started off in the sustainment and maintenance group. And how Corbis did sustainment and maintenance at the time was very, very waterfallish, and just very not effective. And so the incoming CIO challenged them and said, "Hey, we need to fix this because our customers are simply not happy." And so the team got together, led by a gentleman named Darren Davis, got together and kind of dreamt this all up. I happened to be consulting there at the time, and it was my job to then help to scale the practices that the sustainment engineering group did, scale that to the rest of engineering. How we did all of software development for Corbis. We had a couple of big projects that we kicked off, and we're in the process of ramping up a lot of the engineering effort. And so I was there to help. How do we take some of these flow principles that we were playing around with on the sustainment team, and take them to the rest of engineering? So learned a lot from that, and the lessons I learned from there I've carried with me for the rest of my career. Again, more fundamental lessons than anything that I learned at university.
Yeah. No, I'm really interested to sort of talk about those a little bit more in depth. But so I used one technical term, a Kanban, and then you used one flow, and you used another one, waterfall. And so if we could talk about we could probably talk about what those three things are, and then sort of explain your positions on what you've learned about them. So I guess if you could just give the sort of quick introduction to what waterfall planning is in software development.
I keep meaning, because there was a paper. I think the original paper on waterfall was written, I want to say, in the 60s. Do not quote me on this. People are probably going to send you hate mail now. I don't know if they do that anymore, but I think it was in the 60s. And I keep meaning to go back, and I've read excerpts of this paper. But my understanding, when you read the original waterfall paper, it's not as waterfallish as people make it out to be. But the idea behind waterfall, generally speaking, and this might be a crude generalization, but the idea of waterfall is that you essentially have these gates, right? So you do, say you're kicking off a project. So you do a whole bunch of planning and try to discover all of the scope up front. It's like, this is the scope of this project. This is what it's going to be. And you decide that all. And once all that's decided, then you kind of kick it over to analysis. Like, okay, now how do we take this scope and how do we break it into, work that we understand? But then you do all of that analysis. And only when all of that analysis is done and like, okay, now we understand this thing, then you throw it over into development. And you do all of the development on all that analysis, all that scope that you just came up with. And only when you're done with all the development, for all of that scope, then you throw it, everything over the wall and to test and so on and so on. And that's the idea. That's why they kind of call it waterfall, because the stuff just kind of, I was going to say flows, but that's the wrong word. It's more kind of dumps onto the next step. The whole thing kind of just dumps on the next step downstream. It's a very, very, very big batch, big upfront planning type of approach. And it was practiced for many, many years, but certainly with the advent of things like the internet and things like that, where life cycles of projects and things like that became much, being able to get those things shortened became so important. Having things like waterfall meant that you couldn't respond to, market changes as quickly as you needed to. And you can imagine, if you're some poor tester, let's say a project has been scoped to be 18 months. Well, almost certainly the whole schedule will have been chewed up, before anything ever gets to test. And so now, you're this poor tester and you've got, 2 weeks to test something that has been worked on for 18 months. And now you find all these bugs and test, but you're like, well, but we said the project was going to be done in 2 weeks. We don't have any time to fix this stuff. And so it became very, 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 very problematic, which I would argue was the whole impetus behind the rise of Agile, right? That's why Agile practices came to be prominent, because waterfall just wasn't working in the changing marketplace.
Yeah, thanks for that really great answer. I'll give my own sort of building on that. I love the word dump because it does actually capture something kind of affective about the process, right? But there's something I don't really have a term for it, but that I kind of think in my head of like a kind of like self-defeating realism, or a kind of romantic realism, which I encountered in the world of kind of financial modeling myself. But often people think that you're not being rigorous unless you have a really detailed plan. And then they have these ideas that there's the people who are going to be in charge at the top. They're going to commission some people to make a detailed plan, right? So they're dumping off the planning onto those people. Those people write their 100-page Word document about how this program is going to be built. And then they dump that off to some project managers who are like, okay, we've literally got 1,000 spelled out things that need to be done. We're going to hire 100 people to do 10 each. And then we're going to dump that onto those tasks onto those people. And then all the way up the chain, you're going to have people going, what stage are we at? What stage are we at in the plan? What stage are we at in the plan? And then, as you said, at the end, then it gets dumped onto some testers who are often under incredible pressure to not find problems, because the problems are not specified in the plan, and especially any specific ones you might find. And so it's not just that it disrupts the time; it's the whole mindset gets kind of disrupted when you find a problem, and that's why Boeings fall out of the sky, to put it very crudely. And so what in response to these pressures, and what you're describing in your own story, is like people were starting to realize that like there might, in the gap between you making your plan and this product coming out, we might have learned something about the market, and we might want to change something. And so you get the another technical term of Agile being developed. And so in that context, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about exactly how the sort of Kanban process. I mean, let's ignoring sort of all the details of the origin story, which I'll link to, where you talk about that in a talk on YouTube. But what is the Kanban process? What physical form does it take? And for people who, let's say, don't know anything about it at all.
Yeah, and this it's a bit it's maybe a bit abstract than what people might be expecting, or might even assume, in that it's not Kanban is not a formal methodology. It's not even, I would argue, a formal framework. The way that we like to characterize Kanban is more of a strategy. It's a strategy to achieve flow. And the basic thinking is whatever job that you, the global you out there, whatever job you are doing, that job exists probably to deliver value for a customer. There's a customer somewhere that's waiting for your help or your input or whatever, waiting for you to at least contribute to delivery of value. One of the best ways, what we've learned, and we'll probably get into this, one of the best ways to optimize that delivery of value is to focus on this thing called flow. We keep talking about flow. Hopefully we'll talk some more about it, but if you want to optimize customer value, you optimize for flow. If you buy all that, and I am waving my hands, this is a podcast, so nobody can really see me waving my hands or whatever, but I'm waving my hands quite a bit. If you buy that argument, then what Kanban is really, it's a strategy to achieve flow. A strategy. It's not the only strategy, but it is a strategy to achieve flow. So if you use Kanban, you'll achieve flow. If you achieve flow, the idea is you'll probably optimize delivery of customer value in 25 words or less.
Right. Yeah. No, I've got a quote here from your Actionable Agile Metrics book. Simply stated, flow is the movement and delivery of customer value through a process, which is great, because I think it sort of represents it. It's a sort of, in a sense, it's abstract, but it's very grounded in a couple of concepts. Movement, delivery, customer value, and process. But it's a process, not the process, right? And so different companies and teams would presumably find their own. That part of the activity of achieving flow is sort of thinking about how you do things and how you want to do things. But in particular, that customer value concept is very important. And one of the I'm just gathering this from your writings and other things I know about the sort of industry, but like one item of customer value is the answer that you can deliver is answering their question, when will it be done, which is the title of one of your books. And how do you wrap customers' heads around the reality of what kind of value you can give when you answer that question? Because people, to put it sort of like the leading way to put it would be, people want a deterministic prediction, and what you can, the only honesty you can give them is a probabilistic forecast. So if you could just talk, generally speaking, about your position on that, and how you go about explaining that to, say, a sort of recalcitrant customer.
If I can continue my brutal honesty, I don't know that I have a good answer to that. If I did have a good answer to that, I'd probably be sitting on a beach somewhere counting all of my money. And as much as I love you, Len, I probably wouldn't be talking to you, and I'd be doing something else. I don't know. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I wrote that book, because if we can loop back to our original conversation about Waterfall, to me the fatal flaw in Waterfall, if there is just one, is this idea of deterministic thinking. I love the fact that you use determinism. Most people believe that we can know with 100% certainty what our scope is going to be up front. We know with 100% certainty what our schedule is going to be up front, what our finances are going to be up front. And the truth of the matter is we don't. The future is full of uncertainty. I always say this, if you can predict the future, if people are good at predicting the future, then I've got tons of wonderful business ideas for you, because that's, it's generally, the future is just full of uncertainty. Once somebody recognizes that, hey, the future is full of uncertainty, then the next step they need to take is, okay, well, uncertainty means we need to drop deterministic thinking and now start taking a more probabilistic approach and embracing probability, because probability is literally, and I mean literally, is literally the science of uncertainty, right? That's what we're talking about. But getting customers to your original question, getting customers to understand that, hey, this is the best I can do is probably give you a range of possible outcomes, and we can negotiate that range based on whatever agreed, confidence that we need. That's really the best we can do. And another great thing I love that you said is, and by the way, we will learn, as we develop this and as we deliver, both of us will learn, and you'll learn that some of the stuff you thought you needed, you don't need. And some of the stuff you had no idea you needed, you absolutely need. And, and we'll tweak and we'll change, as we go. And our probabilities of being able to deliver certain outcomes will change based on that new information that we get. So I don't know if I faked my way through that answer for you good enough, but that's
no. I think you answered it very well. That it's just the very top of your answer was like it's very difficult, and there's no one answer for how you can convince someone of the truth of the claim that you're making, right? And there's two sort of, and again, like I came across this in sort of in financial modeling and things like that. There are people who there's a sort of like positive thing where they believe it's achievable, and there's a kind of negative thing where they think you're being evasive or weak if you can't, if you refuse to give them that, right? And they're saying, oh, you're just going to use this to take advantage of me, to kind of like draw out the project, or you just haven't thought about it hard enough, or maybe you're not smart enough and don't understand the situation well enough. And when you've pierced that veil yourself, it can be very frustrating, because you think that when I show you a chart now of a projection going forward of something, whether it's a stock or a cryptocurrency or something like that's the reality. Now we know. And that's crazy. That's crazy. But knowing that doesn't make the person stop being crazy, right? To speak in a very self-interested way about this, until you're stuck. You're just stuck with kind of matters of psychology and process and what you can do. But that's why I really like the way you describe you focusing things on customer value. And in addition, you have this great example that you use of hurricanes, and how, like, you go through, I think it was Sandy, in the particular example that you use, Hurricane Sandy, to show like things really can change on a dime, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't try. It means you need to understand what a probabilistic forecast really is.
Yeah, absolutely. And this, this is why I love the work of say people like Annie Duke so much. Is I guess and she's maybe the one you should ask that earlier question. She might have a much better answer than you. But I mean, you essentially really need to think like a poker player. That's really her book is called Thinking in Bets. One of her books. That's how you, and when you get new information. Not only can you not be afraid to change, it almost necessitates or requires a change. At least a consideration of change, and that's why I like the hurricane stuff. Because if you go to the National Hurricane Center, they're not going to tell you that hurricane path with 100% certainty. They're not. In fact, they're very, very clear, that this is a probabilistic model, and we're looking at about 70% chance. When you see those graphs, you're looking at about a 70% chance. And while it's fine for people to get angry with the National Hurricane Center for, hey, why can't you give me 100%, 100% model? It's just not. That's just not the way the world works. It's just not the way the universe works. Richard Feynman talked a lot about this. It's one of the basics of nature. It's one of the building blocks of nature. Probability is intrinsic to nature. It's not a result of something. It's intrinsic. When you go down to the quantum level or below, now we're getting kind of philosophical, but these types of things are intrinsic. So thinking that you can escape them, thinking that you're smarter because, like you said, oh, I showed a graph and now there's uncertainty, or now there's certainty. That's the wrong way to think about it. By the way, I love how you talk about insanity, because human psychology is a big part of this. Things like behavioral economics, I think, enter into this big time.
Well, and something I will confess to being bad at, which is probabilistic thinking. It doesn't come naturally to everybody. In fact, it doesn't come naturally to most of us. And actually, maybe some of the listeners will have heard of this, but if you could explain a little bit the Monty Hall, let's make a deal, sort of classic example of how, I've read the answer to why it works the way it does dozens of times and still haven't really, not dozens, a few times. And I couldn't reproduce the answer if I were asked to do it on my own. But if you could talk a little bit about the three doors, and what the sort of the counterintuitive kind of answer to what you should do in that scenario.
I can try it. That definitely works better with some visuals, but I'm happy to give it a shot. So the idea is on Let's Make a Deal. A contestant is presented with three closed doors. Behind one of the closed doors is a brand new car, and behind the other two closed doors is a goat. And the objective of the game is really easy. If you pick the door that has the car, you win the car, right? And so what Monty Hall does is say, okay, contestant, please pick your door. And the contestant will pick a door. Let's say they pick number two, door number two. What Monty Hall will do then is, once the contestant picks door number two, Monty Hall will open one of the other two doors, door number one or door number three, revealing where one of the goats is. Yeah. So let's say he opens door number three. So now we've got the contestant who chose door number two. We've got door number three that's open and shows a goat. Monty Hall will go back to the contestants and say, okay, I'm going to give you a one-time opportunity here to change your answer. If you want to, you can change your answer. Now that I've shown you there's a goat behind door number three, do you want to stick with your original answer of door number two, or do you want to go to door number one? And most contestants, when given that opportunity to switch, will not. They will stick with their original choice, because this gets into the psychology thing, I think, because the pain of switching, I think this is how I would explain it. The pain of switching and failing is much higher, much greater than the pain of staying and failing. So that's why most people will stay, even though from a mathematics perspective, it's your odds are about double of being right if you switch.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. No, I was going to say that's the part that breaks my brain. I mean, the kind of maybe I'm sort of too impassive. I don't think I would be too much subject to the kind of the pain of switching, and I made regretting my mistake if I switched and it turned out my original choice was right. But it's just that the way my brain goes through that is, no matter what, when I pick a door, there's going to be one that can be picked that has a goat behind it. So how can it possibly make it? That's going to be the same every time I pick a door. There's going to be one door that Monty Hall can pick that does have a goat behind it. So how can it possibly make a difference that when I switch? And of course, there is an answer to that. I think it has something to do with the fact that you've got more information now. The fact that, and Monty Hall had more information than you did when he made his choice. It's something along those lines. But it just doesn't come intuitively to me to get the sort of rigorous reason behind that.
Well, I mean, I can take one more minute, maybe try to explain it, and you tell me if this helps you or not. But for the listeners out there, when all three doors are closed, any door that you choose, you've got a 33% chance of being right. Okay, so once you choose door number 2, in my example, once you choose door number 2, you have a 33% chance of being right. What that really means, the way you really need to think about it, is you actually have a 66% chance of being wrong. Once you chose that door, you have a 66% chance of being wrong. So when Monty Hall opens door number 3 for you, he's done you a huge favor because he's just showed you it's not door number 3 anymore, right? So remember, I now have a 66% chance of being wrong. That means that door that I just chose, that door number 2, 66% chance of being wrong. So I should probably switch. If that makes sense, if that helps you at all.
I could repeat the words back at you, but my you know what I mean? Like I could write down the answer correctly, but I guess what I'm confessing to is my intuition still doesn't really change.
And that's probability for you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that I have a good feel for probabilistic thinking either. I mean, I know that I should be doing it, but I think that's just human nature. We're just not good at it.
Yeah, no, and it's great. I mean, we were sort of making fun of crazy people earlier, but for just believing projections. But and confessing to your own faults can also be helpful for understanding things and explaining things as well. When it comes to flow, so the concept of flow, I think I might have a kind of fun way into asking you your thoughts on that, which is I believe you have a kind of beef with Steve Tendon about his concept of flow. I say that humorously and with the knowledge that you're friendly with each other. Yeah. And Steve has been a guest on the podcast in the past, and has a couple books on Lean Pub. And is that actually a good framing? If it's not, please just give me your own concept of flow. I thought maybe a compare and contrast might help.
Yeah. So Steve is a very good friend of mine. We talk all the time. In fact, we just talked yesterday. As a matter of fact. And so Steve Tendon talks a lot about what's known as the theory of constraints. I personally have not found much. What's the word I'm looking for? I was going to say value, but I don't know if that's the right word. Much, whatever it is, whatever that word is, in applying the theory of constraints. I've gotten much more bang for the buck in applying Deming. Or hopefully people have heard of Deming, but even Deming's mentor, Walter Short, in their theory of variation. So it's not. I may come across this way. I don't mean to. I'm not saying that Steve is wrong and I'm right. I'm saying there are many, many competing theories out there around flow, all of which are probably valid to some degree. I just tend to favor more looking at flow from a variation perspective. Steve just tends to look at it more from the theory of constraints perspective. If I'm being completely honest, depending on how many beers you get into me, at the end of the day, we're probably both right. So it's, a lot of times we're probably just arguing over semantics. And he points this out to me all the time. He's like, Dan, you're doing, you say you're not doing theory of constraints, but you are doing theory of constraints. And I have a hard time arguing with him when he says that.
Yeah, maybe we could go into a little bit more detail there about what the variation perspective is and what you mean by that. I think probably a lot of our listeners will be familiar with Deming and kind of like this kind of high level kind of thinking and how it sort of makes its way into these, into Post-it notes on boards or what have you. But yeah, if you could talk a little bit about the variation perspective that you mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, it might help to maybe start with the theory of constraints perspective too. And again, I'll caveat this with I am not an expert at theory of constraints. So again, if you get hate mail, this is all my fault. I might be saying it all wrong. But theory of constraints roughly says is that in a given process, there is only one for lack of a better word, governing constraint, right? There's a part of your process that is going to govern the operation of the rest of the process. That's the constraint, and all your decisions around how the process operates should be subordinated to understanding of where that constraint is, and what's commonly called is exploiting that constraint. I think exploiting is a terrible word, but whatever. The big assumption with the theory of constraints then is that you can identify where that constraint is, right? That's the big and even the people in the theory of constraints community, I think, would say, hey, you know what? If you guess wrong, you're applying the theory of constraints and you guess wrong where that constraint is, you're actually going to do more harm than good, right? And that's why I come in, because forgetting for a second the whole debate around, is software development complex or chaotic or simple or whatever, forgetting the whole Stacy or Knebben model stuff. There is a lot of variability in what we do. There's variability in item size. There's variability in people's ability to do work. There's variability in how process is structured. There's variability in global pandemics coming through. There's all kinds of variability that we have to deal with that I think make it very, very, very hard in a process to say, yes, without a doubt, that's where the constraint is, because that variability will change from day to day. It will change, and it will make it look, the variability and flow, variation and flow will make it look like constraint is here one day and then here another day and then here another day. And so that's why I think understanding and controlling for variability, I believe, is a little bit more effective approach. That's not to say, just want to be clear, that's not to say you shouldn't study theory of constraints and read a little bit more about that, because in your context, maybe it is very, very, very easy to see where that constraint is.
And maybe to give people an image, so what would an example of a constraint be, for example, if we're actually applying this to a circumstance? Like, let's say, for example, you've got, you're managing a big software development project, mm-hmm. and you're watching, let's say you've got 10 rows where you're watching things flow from left to right, so started to finished. And you can see, I think there are apps you can use that you can also do this physically, but you can change the colors to sort of, they'll stay green as long as they're good, and they'll start sort of dimming to red if they're going bad. And then, so a theory of constraints person would probably want, I'm just making this up, but like, would they go there and look for a constraint, like not enough developers working on that? Would that be a constraint?
So something like that. Let's maybe even, if I may take that
Please.
Metaphor, maybe simplify it a little bit. Let's look at a single team, and let's say on this team we have analysts and developers and testers, and let's say, again, I'm not saying you should do this, but let's say that those people are very, very siloed. Analysts can only do analysis, developers can only do development, and testers can only do testing. Again, just to make that example simple. And so let's stay on that team. You've got 10 analysts, 1 developer, and 22 testers, right? Just for example. Well, it's pretty obvious there that development's probably your constraint, because the developers are not going to be able to keep up with the work that the analysts are probably throwing over the wall at them. And then your testers are probably going to be starved for work because the poor developer is, overwhelmed and nothing's getting through to test. And we've got 22 testers sitting around. So that constraint it's called a constraint because that's where well, I was going to say the slowest flow is happening, but it actually manifests itself as the longest amount of time to get through that queue. So I don't know if that helps a little bit. That's wherever that flow is constrained, where we're not getting the throughput that we expect. That's
no, I think that's a really great, very clear example, especially with the sort of the numbers being put that way. It's a very clear example, and it puts it in the context of one team trying to develop some app or features or something like that. And just for people listening, it's so interesting how much depth there is to this field that one might not be from, and I'm just a dabbler myself, but so for example, you might think from that example, what we need to do is throw more people at the problem, and then there's this concept that people who've read about software development will know about the Mythical Man Month, for example, where, what was the, I saw a joke when I was researching for this that someone made. I don't know if it was you, but it was like, if you want someone to finish reading a book faster, just buy them another copy, buy them a second copy or something like that. But it sort of captures the spirit of the Mythical Man Month. And so the idea of like managing what you do with that constraint kind of, isn't necessarily straightforward, even if you've identified it.
Yeah. And this is the fundamental problem with flow is we like to say it's unintuitive to the point of being counterintuitive, because you're right. Initial reaction might be, let's throw a whole bunch of people at it. Let's throw a whole bunch of money at it. But in the short term, the absolute best thing that you can do when you've identified that constraint, or just in general, when you've identified variation in your flow, is to work on less. Not to try and do more, is actually to work on less. And there's a whole bunch of queuing theory to support the fact that, when you see problems with flow like that, work on less. That's the whole, I would say the whole underlying organizing principle behind Kanban. And that just freaks people out. I was just like, what? I'm going to get more stuff done faster by working on less? Yes. And then once we have a good understanding of that, then we can talk about, well, should we be adding people? Should we be spending money or whatever? But until you've got control of the number of things that we're working on, any of those types of decisions are premature, and not just a little premature, like very, very premature.
That's interesting. That reminded me of a metaphor that you use in, I think, the introduction to one of your books, where you talk about how, like, basically what you've done, what often you might find if you start analyzing your process, you find that you've done a DDoS attack on yourself. I mean, I'm laughing, but like, or distributed denial of service attack, for those unfamiliar, where basically you probably heard of it, like the website's gone down because some bad actors sort of threw too many kind of eyeballs at it at the same time, and it couldn't handle the load. But we often do this kind of thing to ourselves because it's not just easy, but it's kind of like makes you feel productive to start new tasks and start new tasks and start new tasks. But if you're not focusing on actually finishing the ones that you've started, now you're kind of working on unfinished things all the time that never get done. Yeah.
I love that you phrase it. Yes, it feels more productive to start more stuff, but you're actually more productive if you finish more stuff. That's where you're actually more productive. And this is where I think, when bringing in some of the metrics and things like that to the conversation, simultaneously make it easier and harder. Because of all the things that we've talked about, because of, people need to understand probability, and then people need to accept that, hey, their intuition is letting them down.
Yeah. And there's actually, that reminds me of something that I thought about a fair amount, which is, one thing that when people are managing, are paying teams of people to do work, there is a strong psychological need to have everybody be busy all the time. Otherwise, you feel like you're wasting money. And so, for example, sometimes if everybody's busy all the time, that means you have no one available to sort of handle something unexpected that needs to be done. But another version of that problem, like I live here every day in the city of Victoria, where the city loves to operate. It has lots of people to operate machines to do work. And very clearly, the ethos is that nobody should ever be idle. So what that means is there's guys literally blowing leaf blowers at like a single leaf pasted to the sidewalk in the rain, because it would be a waste to have that person not be working. And it's like, well, actually what it does is it just means that we're constantly assaulted all throughout every day of our lives with all this unnecessary disruption to our lives, because people don't want to wait. They don't want to just leave the equipment idle. So once you've got it, that means someone needs to be driving it around all the time or whatever. How do you have any kind of like big answers for if you were brought into an organization like where you saw this problem, like you're doing too much, but that doesn't mean you should fire anybody. Right. How do you explain that?
Well, there's several good examples out there. An extreme example, if we talk about society at large, an extreme example of society that we understand this is we literally pay fire persons and paramedics to sit around and do nothing, waiting for, like I said, like you were saying, waiting for that emergency. Can you imagine if paramedics, let's just say paramedics showed up for their job and there was no call out or whatever. So we started forcing them to go pick up a leaf blower, and start cleaning the
Keep
sidewalks.
busy.
And then, they're like 3 miles away from the hospital by, when the call comes in. So, that's kind of the extreme example is, if you don't build Slack into the system, then very, very, very bad things are going to happen. Companies like FedEx and UPS understand this very well. They've got tons of empty planes, tons of empty trucks, a lot of times either circling in the air or just driving. So whenever there is a problem, they can divert, those empty resources. Not that I'm necessarily calling them people resources. That's another conversation. To go help out with those problems of flow. So, yeah. It's funny how we think about waste. Most people think that idleness is waste, where, this is to me, this is the brilliance of Toyota. They realized it was like, overburdening. That's really what's waste.
Yeah, that actually reminds me. I was just going to say another example of sort of like the way we sort of like feel waste when we're just not thinking it through properly can be, for example, I was just thinking, like let's say a paramedic. I've got a cousin who's a firefighter, and so he's done some self-defense training. Right? There's a certain way of thinking where you can say, what if he got to the end of his career and he never used it? Does he then relate to it? Oh, I wasted all that time doing self-defense training because I never actually got attacked. It's like, no, it wasn't a waste. But that's where probability comes in, right? Because like there is going to be some proportion of firefighters who go out because they're not just fighting fires, right? Like they do all kinds of other things as well. And there's going to be some proportion of them that do encounter this. So someone somewhere has to be counting the beans and going, well, actually everybody should be devoting this much of their time, their training time to self-defense because, add actuarial analysis here.
Yeah. It's the whole, not to get too overly technical, but it's the whole, ex post versus ex ante analysis. This, and what we're talking about way before too. People think that all this stuff should be knowable up front. And if you get an outcome where, hey, I never used self-defense, I think is what you said. I never, once you know that sample path and you say, oh, well, then I should have never done it. Well, that's kind of the ex ante ex post analysis. Just because the sample path is known doesn't necessarily mean there weren't other possibilities. You could have just as equally, been attacked 50 times in your career, or whatever. So, to bring up another technical term and your latest book, Flow Metrics for Scrum Teams, the word Scrum is in there. And in the introduction to the book, it says the book is partly about things Dan disliked about Scrum. So I think there are probably people listening who are waiting to hear you talk about that. What's your sort of general position? Well, what is Scrum? What's your general position on it? And yeah. My general position on it, it's not that Scrum is necessarily a bad thing. I think Scrum had a place. If we rewind 20 years ago, because we were talking about waterfall and the rise of agile practices. 20 years ago, if I was starting out, and I had to choose waterfall versus Scrum, well, of course I would. At that time, I would have chosen Scrum hands down, right? Every day of the week and twice on Sunday, right? That's the way I would have chosen to work. But maybe because I lived through it, I always think of Scrum as a reaction to waterfall. To me, that's the reason that Scrum existed, and that's the reason why it was successful, is because it was a good alternative, or potentially a great alternative to waterfall. But think about all the things that have happened specifically in software development, and I would argue maybe potentially in knowledge work in general, but especially software development over the years, around the tooling and the practices that we've developed. We developed things like continuous integration. 20 years ago, how many companies did you know that were doing continuous integration? And now it's kind of table stakes. 20 years ago, how many people companies did you know that were doing continuous deployment, continuous delivery? Hardly anybody, but now it's table stakes. And so the engineering practices have evolved to be more and more and more continuous. What I don't understand is, why haven't agile practitioners caught up to that? And say, if your engineering practices are continuous, your process has to be continuous too. Your process has to be continuous to support that. And so, if I had a gripe with Scrum, it would be, it's still kind of anchored in that kind of batchy thinking, where I think we need much more continuous processes to support the way that we work today.
And yeah, just to drill in on what you mean when you're talking about continuous processes, for agile kind of management, you talk about aging work, the concept of aging work in progress, and I think it's the one you call the most important chart you'll ever see, or something like that. But the aging work in progress chart. So if you could talk, a little bit about what aging work in progress is, and how what a chart like that looks like, things like that.
Yeah, the idea behind aging is, so if we talk about flow being the way to optimize customer delivery, the important part of that is that we deliver something to the customer. The problem with things like a definition of done, Scrum has an emphasis on the definition of done, and things like that. There are good things about that, but the problem with that is you have to actually be done before you know something's wrong, right? I mean, but by that time, that's a lot of times that's too late of a signal. From a flow perspective, we want a signal as early as possible that something may be going wrong. And the best signal that I found by far, is to focus on something called aging. So, in a process, you've always got, whether you know it or not, you've always got at least two defined points, a point at which something is considered started and a point at which something is considered finished. And what aging measures is how long has it been since this thing that we're working on, this value item, whatever it is, how long has it been since it's crossed that start point? Because if we're monitoring that, especially in relation to how long it's taken us to complete stuff in the past, that's going to give us a very, very, very early signal, even before the thing is done, that, hey, maybe something's wrong here. It's bigger than what we thought. Maybe we don't have the right people, on here. Maybe it needs to be, broken up, or better analysis needs to be done. It's blocked, whatever it is, right? It's going to give us, the aging is going to give us a wonderful signal that some action may need to be taken.
Actually, you mentioned earlier living through something and knowledge work, and we've just I'm going to be asking a question about metrics, so I'll start from over here, but I'll end up over there. Okay. But we just went through a pandemic. It's still going on to some extent, although a lot of the sort of lockdown and restrictions have been lifted. But this brought with it a huge shift towards working from home, as people call it, or working remotely. There's areas like medicine, for example, where like they say that, there's 10 years of progress in one year in terms of telemedicine and things like that. But one challenge that sort of remote work for organizations that aren't familiar with it presents is monitoring. The crude version of it is monitoring people. The sort of more, I guess, to use loaded language, refined version is monitoring what you're calling processes. But there was a lot of there was a sort of genre of news article about how bosses can't monitor their workers anymore, and how this is a big problem for companies. And I was just wondering, just since I've got you here, and this is kind of your area, what have your thoughts been as you've been watching this happen, or even being a part of it? If you had any sort of work that you had to do that was related to it.
Well, first, shameless plug here. It's one of the reasons why I love a Kanban-esque approach, is because, and you've probably heard this idiom or euphemism or whatever you want to call it, but in Kanban, we focus on the work, not the worker. What we really care about is getting those things done. I don't care who's working on it. I don't care what their skill. I don't care. It's like, are we getting this stuff done? And if we're not getting this stuff done, how are we as a team or organization going to self-organize to solve those problems? Whatever answer I give is going to be kind of, colored by that perspective. So I don't necessarily see a problem with, remote working or being in the office or hybrid. My guess is, I don't really have a strong opinion on this, but my guess is some hybrid is going to prevail. With the genie's out of the bottle. Right, Pandora's opened that box, and we're not going to close it again. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Again, as long as we have an ability to. I think, like I said, I think we'd be more about monitoring the work and not necessarily who's doing the work. And if we see a problem with how work is getting done, then questions need to be asked. But it's not the question. From a Deming perspective, if we see teams are dropping in productivity, The question isn't why do you suck, right? That's not the question. The question is what about how we've designed our process is failing us, and what are the changes in the process that we need to make to enable people in this brave new world to be as effective as they can be.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. Thanks for that. My kind of anecdotal kind of or vicarious experience of it was of sort of like the way that these changes were being represented was very, very grumpy because I think one thing that was exposed, the story wasn't told this way, generally speaking, but what was exposed was that a lot of organizations and a lot of managers didn't exist to get the work done primarily. They existed for some kind of ethic, right? An example would be, I read numerous examples of this where it's kind of like, how do I know if I send the analyst off to make a presentation on X and they come back 7 hours later that they really spent 7 hours working on it? And it's like, no serious person thinks that way. On a person who might be rich, they might be successful, they might be in a position of power, they might have just success after success and promotion after promotion their whole lives. But that is not a serious way to achieve anything other than maintain the organization's ethic. And I think a lot of what was exposed was, and again, it gets represented as, workers just want to sit around in their sweatpants. And it's like, actually what they really want to do is work. They really want to achieve the goals that they're there to do rather than be monitored all the time for keystrokes and what have you. And if you just actually, one of the big lessons is if you actually just trust people to have enough the self-respect that they mostly do have, you're actually going to end up with a much more productive team. And whether you settle on a hybrid, model or not, it's making sure that you're actually trying to get the thing done. It's the most important thing that you can do.
Right. And not to sound like a broken record, but certainly there's going to be a percentage of people out there that are going to take advantage of that system. I mean, that is going to happen. But again, if we take a Deming approach, it's like, maybe 5% of the people are taking advantage of the system, but 95% of the people are probably, exactly like what you're saying. And they want to be empowered and they want to be given the, independence and autonomy just to get their work done. But we have a tendency to focus on that 5%. Well, because there's 5% over there, that are doing bad, that means the whole process is broken. Well, actually, no, it's quite the opposite. It's actually probably working much better than we want to acknowledge.
And speaking just generally of the pandemic and the effects it has as well, or it's had as well. So you mentioned Kanban as a strategy, but people who've heard about it will probably have a very specific image in their head of like a whiteboard or even a wall with Post-it notes in rows and columns on it, and stuff like that. Have you seen people? I mean, obviously, people kind of had to shift more towards using apps basically to sort of manage this kind of stuff, even if they would favor having a physical wall. Do you think that there's something important that's lost by not having people gathering in one place to view the same physical thing?
Probably. I mean, because I always said before the pandemic, I always said my favorite Kanban tool was a physical board. That was by far and away my favorite tool. And the thing is now having developed a tool of myself for myself, the truth of the matter is that all tools work and all tools don't work. It really just comes down to how you use them. So, people love to rail against Jira, people love to rail against Azure DevOps, whatever. And it's like you can, for Kanban, is Jira ideal? Well, for the expert, user out there, it probably isn't. But for most teams, it's probably good enough. Same thing with Azure DevOps. There are things that drive me nuts about both of those things. But are they workable? Are they usable? Absolutely. So is there something that's lost from people not being together and huddled around a physical board? Maybe, probably, but I don't think any of that is fatal or overcomable or any of that. I think we've learned in the past couple of years, in fact, how to overcome some of those things. So I'm not that worried about it.
On that optimistic note, maybe it's time, and in the interest of time, to move on to the last part of the interview where we talk about your experience as a writer. And so as someone who sort of, thinks about process and stuff like that, I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about do you, that doesn't necessarily mean you do, but do you have a process for writing? Do you self-monitor your progress and things like that?
So I I used to be a big outliner. I used to, I'd be like, I'd have an idea and I'd sit down and I'd kind of write an outline of all the stuff that I want to say. That has evolved dramatically over several years to where anymore I'm driven by, oh, this is going to sound bad, but I'm going to say it anyway. Anymore I'm driven by anger. Something will just piss me off and I'll just start writing it. And I find that taking that more stream of consciousness type of approach, just have a blank piece of paper and just start typing, is what works for me. And as a writer, that was probably the biggest thing for me to get over. Of you've got the tyranny of the blank page, and you feel like every sentence that you have to write has to be perfect, right? It has to be exactly what you want it to be. And this idea that, oh yeah, you can always edit it later and you can change and rearrange, and for me it's much more effective. Just start typing, and it's okay to throw stuff away. So that's how my thinking has evolved over the past several years.
That's a really great answer. I kind of say that partly because I identify with it. Anger is a form of passion. It's also which is a good thing to have if you're writing usually. Anger is also distinct from rage. Rage is uncontrolled anger. That's what you definitely want to avoid that. But anger is a fine motivation for doing things. In particular, I was getting angry myself mentioning this genre of terrible article published in major publication after major publication about the future of work and working from home by people who evidently didn't take 10 minutes to kind of look into the fact that, there's a lot of research and whole areas of study that have existed for decades on this kind of stuff. There's, companies like HashiCorp that have never had an office, but instead, by just to pick an example, like, the Globe and Mail in Canada, their expert on what's going to happen to the future of work is a CEO of an office space leasing company in Toronto. Like, yeah, right. That's a good source for information.
Right.
But anger, and not just in, the kind of blogosphere where obviously anger plays a role, and kind of like I'm going to get a short post out, but it is important, I think, to sometimes to sort of, you take that as a good motivation, for getting you. And why are you angry? Right. Well, you should think about it. Like, you might actually have very good reason to be angry. And then as a writer, you're sort of confronted with the second. Keep in mind, you probably have an opportunity to do second draft or to edit it later, and so you can kind of shave off the parts that were maybe not so well controlled when you were writing. But I think anger's a great motivation for a great way to get started writing something.
Well, and if I can give a plug for LeanPub, it's the whole reason that I picked LeanPub as my first medium for publishing, was because I could get it wrong, and there was essentially zero cost to me to get something wrong. It's like, oh, okay, I'll just fix it and push another button, and hey, look, it's published. I don't quite like that. So that LeanPub acted as a wonderful outlet for that anger. I could write something, I could put it up, and I'm a very visual writer too. I like to see it, which is one thing we should talk about. I don't know if I necessarily agree with separating out formatting from content. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. To me, format is content, but that's maybe you can have me back and we can have this whole philosophical debate about that. But anyway, I like to see it. And with LeanPub, it's just so easy for me to put something new out there, generate a PDF, and just kind of see how it looks,
You brought up formatting and content. So I've got a doctorate in English literature for my sins. So
I stepped in it. I'm sorry.
No. This is, this is actually an argument I've had from your what I imagine some version of what your position is, borrowing, if you want to go all high philosophical, borrowing from Hegel about the unity of form and content in a very deep. That's not just, he would make that claim not just about writing, if you know what I mean, but about history itself. But no, there are some projects where formatting and content are not distinct. To pick from the history of English literature, Tristram Shandy is an example of that. But there's all kinds of other things where form and content are, from a certain perspective of like hermeneutical analysis, there's just no distinction. For some projects, whether you know all the fancy words or whatever, it's just obviously the form and the content are not distinct. That can be from for example, from an experiential kind of perspective, and I certainly agree with that. But what for those listening, what you're bringing up is the fact that when people encounter formatting problems with LeanPub, I should say limitations, our textbook answer is formatting is procrastination while you're writing.
Yeah.
That qualification at the end there sort of leaves us a little bit of an out from the stronger claim that's being made there. But it is true that is something we do say. And I'd say it myself. I believe that it is 95% of the time the right thing to tell a writer. You shouldn't be worrying. And like talking about myself there, where it's like, oh, like, let's go off in the format. You're not writing anymore. But every time I say it, I feel bad. Because I do believe that formatting is very important for lots and lots of projects.
Well, I would and just hopefully I was just having a dig at your expense there. But the thing is, if we do take the kind of small batch, because LeanPub's all about publish early, publish often, right? That's really why I think it exists, which is wonderful. But the publish early, publish often, to me, it's like when I'm looking at a revision of something I've written, I'm trying to look at it from the perspective of how my consumer is going to, and if it's just kind of trash, it's like, if I can't tell the difference between is this a new heading or is this a new section of the book, and did I reference the figure right? Because you probably saw my book. So I think my first book has 120 graphics in it or something ridiculous like that, which was painful. In LeanPub's original Markdown flavor was painful to get all those images just right. But so anyway,
yeah, no. I really appreciate the feedback, and that's great. And the one of the sort of on that note, one of the requests that we get over and over again is like, it would be great to see an instant rendering of my page, because the way LeanPub works, if you're using one of our writing modes, we have an upload writing mode. So by the way, for anyone listening, like if you don't want to learn any of this stuff, if you've got an ebook file, you can upload it to LeanPub and be making 80% royalties in 5 minutes. But if you want to use one of our writing modes, we have a word writing mode as well. It's rather limited in terms of formatting, but most LeanPub books are written in plain text. And what that means is they have to go through a kind of rendering. So our book generators, as we call them, read the instructions that you've written, because you don't just write the sort of paragraphs. You have to write the formatting instructions in there too. Like, this is a chapter heading. It's it's a pound sign. But then there needs to be this rendering going on. And so what you have to do is you just kind of have to cross your fingers and hope you got it right and click the button, and then maybe go down to page 182 where you made your latest change and see, did that actually work? And that is an inherently painful process. And it is something we've had people ask for, like an instant rendering of the page, right on the left, rendering on the right, stuff like that. And, it's possible that someday we'll have something along those lines. But definitely, like we know that there's these, especially when it comes to formatting, there is really just an inherent kind of difficulty when it's not WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get, right? There's some difference between what you do and what you actually write and what's produced. With that said, the last question I always like to ask on the podcast, if the guest is a LeanPub author, is if there was one magic feature we could build for you, or if there was one thing other than formatting that you were constantly shaking your fist at the screen and shouting at LeanPub for, that we could fix for you. Is there anything that you can think of that you would ask us to do?
So, and that's I was just thinking about it, even before you reached out to me for the podcast, writing the last book. The only thing that really makes me angry, I apologize, it's a formatting thing. But if I have several headings, if I have like a heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, heading 4, and because I reached out to support and asked if I could do this, and they said no. But I want to be able to give different styles or different fonts or different whatever for each of those subheadings, and they said no, it's impossible to do that.
Yeah, we created a story based on that feedback, and for discussion. It's not something we're going to do anytime soon, unfortunately. Sorry about that. But yeah, what Daniel's talking about for anyone listening is that like we've got level heading 1, level heading 2, level heading 3, and we just do what we decide with that formatting instruction. You can't tweak it so to make it different font. Choose a different font from the body font, or well, we no, you can set the title font, but that's you can't change it. Yeah, but it's a global setting. You can't do it on a per heading or per heading, and you can't do it on a heading level thing either. Yeah. And I can see how that'd be very frustrating, especially because if you use things like Microsoft Word, you can easily just select that text and sort of change the color or change the font or make it, well, you can make ours italics. But I understand the request, and yeah, we did see it, so, sorry. The answer is that's not going to be happening anytime soon.
It's and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but where it really becomes a problem is in editing. Because I'll cut and paste whole sections, to different parts of the book. I'm like, oh, I had this in chapter 2. It's really a chapter 7 thing. But if all the headings look the same, I don't, and then I lose. I'm like, oh shit, was this really a subheading of this or whatever? And it was just, I'm selfish and I'm lazy, so you'll just have to know that.
Well, and you should be, and it's our job to give authors what they need. And by the way, if there's lots of features that we do have that you do like, they're there because someone did exactly what you just did now years ago or last week, and we responded by saying okay. So we really appreciate the feedback. It's
no, sorry, I was just gonna say, but I again, if I can end on a positive note, there's a reason I keep coming back to LeanPub. There's a reason I just published the Flow Metrics for Scrum book, just published, I think 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, or whatever.
Yeah.
And just the whole philosophy behind LeanPub, the fact that I can keep my copyright, the fact the thing that honestly, the original thing that sold me on LeanPub was it's so open. You're like, here, we'll even create the file so you can export this thing off to Amazon and sell your stuff to Amazon. Honestly, that was the thing that hooked me, and I was like, this is just a wonderful. That's just a wonderful thing. So I will keep coming back to LeanPub and publishing all my books because of the openness of the platform. I just love it.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I really appreciate that. That actually might give me an opportunity to I almost buried the lead here, which is we actually do have another kind of out, and it isn't for when it comes to formatting, and it's an export based out, and we have InDesign export. And the idea there is that you can write your book on LeanPub, and you could potentially not care about. You could be like, I'm a writer, I don't do formatting. That's for book designers. And so we actually have a thing where you can export the InDesign files, and we have had people in the past who are like, I'm familiar with the conventional publishing process. I'm the writer. I write the manuscript. Then I'm going to, even if they're self-publishing, they're like, I'm going to hand this off to a book designer that I'm going to pay, and they can use that. And when it comes to the openness, I think one of the things that we sometimes have a hard time communicating, and that's all our fault, is that, when you write a book on LeanPub, you don't have to just publish on LeanPub. You don't have to publish it on LeanPub at all. We just want authors using our platform and that kind of thing. And in the self-publishing world, I don't know if you're familiar with the term going wide, but that's kind of the sort of settled upon technical term for one approach to self-publishing is put it on all the platforms. That's the position we've taken. We do say if you're doing your own promoting, you're probably making more money per sale on LeanPub. So if you're making a specific personal recommendation, like you're standing in front of a conference, probably point them to LeanPub is the best idea. But we don't have nearly the eyeballs of Amazon. So if you want to get the eyeballs and the sort of conventional recognition, please go put your book on Amazon and go wide. The other version is put your eggs in one basket is the very technical term that people use, and just put it in one place and and the idea there is put all your marketing in one spot, not in multiple spots. Well, thank you very much for taking the time out of what I'm sure is a beautiful day in the Miami area to talk to me and to talk to our audience. And thank you very much for being a LeanPub author. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for the platform. Thanks for everything that you do. And thanks for the invitation. I was just looking at the clock. It was almost an hour and a half we've been talking. It doesn't feel like that at all. So hope the listeners feel the same way when we get to the edited version of this. But yeah, I can listen to myself talk, all day. But anyway, thanks so much for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and look forward to hopefully some future conversations.
Thanks. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a Lean Pub author yourself, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.